Okay, let's just dive right into this. 50%. That is a staggering, explosive number. And it's the exact tariff rate that Donald Trump recently slapped on Indian goods. I mean, it's a massive, unprecedented hike. And it immediately makes you wonder, why? What could possibly drive such an aggressive geopolitical maneuver between two of the biggest economies on the planet? Well, welcome to today's Explainer, where we are going to unpack exactly that. We're going way beyond the daily headlines to uncover the deep historical traumas, the cutthroat economic realities, and those immovable cultural lines that are actually driving this massive standoff between the United States and India. Here is our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start by looking at the current standoff. Then we'll briefly trace the history of global trade wars, uncover the traumatic PL 480 crisis, examine the threat of genetically modified crops, and finally look at the absolute necessity of protecting India's dairy farmers. So let's get into Section 1, the standoff, and this intense geopolitical deadlock. To understand this, you really have to grasp the sheer scale of the money involved here. It is staggering. India exports a massive $87.3 billion in goods to the U.S. So a 50% tariff, that isn't just some political talking point. It directly hits a massive chunk of India's economy. We're talking key sectors like textiles, garments, footwear, and jewelry. The stakes here literally could not be higher. The whole deadlock basically centers on two completely unyielding positions. On one side, you have the U.S. demanding that India open up its vast agricultural and dairy markets to American farmers. This is something the Trump administration desperately needs to offset its own trade wars with China. But on the other side, India has firmly, flat-out refused to open those markets. And instead of bowing to the pressure, India actually fired back. They retaliated by slapping a 2% digital service tax on U.S. tech giants like Amazon, Google, and Apple. It's a classic high-stakes standoff. Moving on to Section 2, global trade wars and exactly why tariffs tend to spiral out of control. You know, the concept of taxing trade is ancient. It's literally as old as civilization. If we trace it back, we see things like the Nishatam transit tax all the way back in 1800 BC in Mesopotamia, where local rulers demanded a cut of profits from passing traders. Fast forward a few millennia to 1930 and we hit the disastrous Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in the U.S. They slapped massive taxes on foreign goods, hoping to protect local jobs during an economic crash. Well, the catastrophic results of that act ultimately led to the formation of GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, in 1947. And that was designed specifically to stabilize global trade and prevent these exact kinds of tariff wars. But why did the world even need an agreement like GATT? Well, it comes down to this number, 66%. When the U.S. enacted those Smoot-Hawley tariffs in 1930, it sparked incredibly aggressive retaliatory tariffs from 25 other countries. And the result? Global trade absolutely plummeted by a staggering 66%. It pushed global unemployment up to nearly 25% and deeply worsened the Great Depression. Unchecked tariffs, they don't just hurt your target, they can destroy the entire global ecosystem. Which brings us to Section 3, the PL 480 crisis. This is a very real Cold War scar. Under Public Law 480, which was enacted in 1954, the U.S. started exporting its surplus wheat to developing nations. Now, at the time, India was facing severe droughts and famine. And lacking U.S. dollars, India agreed to buy this cheap American wheat using its own currency, rupees. On the surface, it looked like a total lifeline. But the reality on the ground was far, far darker. Let's really look at how the U.S. essentially weaponized this dependency. First off, multiple reports confirmed that the U.S. was sending what was called pig-quality wheat. This was grain considered completely unfit for human consumption back in America, yet it was being shipped to a starving India. And because it was so cheap, local Indian farmers just couldn't compete. That pushed India to rely on the U.S. for a terrifying 40% of its wheat. Then, during the 1965 Indo-Pak War and amid all these disagreements over the Vietnam War, the U.S. actually deliberately delayed and withheld these crucial food shipments to force India's political compliance. They literally used food as a weapon. The humiliation of this era was profound. The Indian Prime Minister at the time, Indira Gandhi, frequently had to make these degrading phone calls to the U.S. president literally just to ensure her citizens wouldn't starve. This sparked a massive defining resolve in the country, leading to the famous quote, "India will never again beg for food from another country." That was it. That was the exact moment food independence transformed from a simple economic goal into an absolutely uncompromisable issue of national security. Now let's jump to Section 4, the threat of GM crops and the harsh biological realities of modern farming. This historical trauma we just talked about It perfectly explains why India is so afraid of the modern cycle of dependency built by massive agricultural giants. Companies like Monsanto, they use a very specific, ruthless playbook. Step 1, modify seeds genetically so they withstand specific weed killers. Step 2, sell those proprietary chemical sprays back to the farmers. Step 3, legally force farmers to sign contracts that ban them from storing seeds for the next season. And Step 4, extract massive royalties. The farmer is suddenly trapped. They're forced to buy new seeds and chemicals from a foreign corporation every single year. So what actually happens if India just caves and opens the floodgates to U.S. imports? Well, just look at the math here. Thanks to massive government subsidies and highly advanced industrialized farming, U.S. corn costs around 1,700 rupees per quintal. But in India, the minimum support price just to keep local farmers afloat is 2,400 rupees per quintal. Heavily subsidized U.S. farming would instantly, absolutely price out local Indian farmers, recreating that exact same dependency crisis from the 1960s. And we know this happens because we've seen the devastating historical precedents. When Mexico opened its markets under NAFTA, an estimated 2 million local farmers were displaced by subsidized U.S. corn. In Haiti, under pressure from global banks, tariffs on rice were dropped to just 3%. Their local rice industry completely died, leaving them 80% dependent on the U.S. Plus, introducing GM crops risks cross-pollination, where GM DNA contaminates normal Indian crops. And since GM foods are strictly banned in places like the EU and Russia, India's entire agricultural export market to those regions would be instantly ruined. There's just no way around it. Let's move to Section 5, India's dairy sector. This is the unbreakable red line. The reasons dairy is completely closed off in these negotiations are both economic and cultural. Economically, over 8 crore, that's 80 million Indian families, rely directly or indirectly on dairy farming, and they are surviving on razor-thin margins of just 3 to 5%. Subsidized U.S. milk entering the market at 30 to 35 rupees a liter, it would wipe them out overnight. Culturally, though, there's an absolute religious impossibility here. To boost protein, U.S. industrial farming feeds its cattle blood meal and meat bones. Importing milk from cows fed with non-vegetarian slaughterhouse byproducts would cause massive religious outrage in India. It is a complete non-starter. The ultimate reality of this standoff comes down to one crucial demographic fact. Nearly half of India's entire population, 45 to 48%, depends directly on agriculture for their livelihood, contributing up to 18% of the national GDP. So for any Indian government, completely regardless of which political party is in power, trading away the agricultural or dairy sector isn't just bad economics. It is immediate guaranteed political suicide. They simply cannot blink. Which brings us to the ultimate question. The U.S. desperately needs alternative agricultural markets to satisfy rural voters and compensate for ongoing trade friction with China. Meanwhile, India is fighting for its demographic survival, fiercely protecting its food security to prevent a repeat of historical trauma. So, in a trade war where neither side can afford to lose, who blinks first? It's a question that's going to define the future of global trade. Keep an eye on this space. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.